Welcome back to the Long Way Back podcast. I'm Timmy Long, your host. I'm joined this evening by Donald Clifford. Hi, Tony. So today we have Niall O'Carroll, who's a sports psychologist, amongst other things. You have your own podcast as well, Anisha Creeps, and
what's the name of it? Sorry,
Anisha Creeps. If I'm
I'll explain all of
it. But you've done tours around different countries and worked with different sports teams. But when I looked into it, what really crept out for me was this: the community I come from, right, has talent coming out through its fucking ears, right? Soccer, boxing, GA, and a lot of these kids get caught up in stuff at the age of 13, 14, 15. And I was saying this could be an interesting conversation on top of everything else. So before we get into that, do you want to give us a small bit of an introduction, a bit of background to yourself?
I suppose it'd be fair to say that my career hasn't been, I suppose the term non-linear has often been used. I, like a lot of kids in Ireland, didn't have the greatest schooling career because schooling wasn't for me. And I discovered about a year ago that I've got ADHD, and I understand so much about dyslexia and all sorts of things. So I understand so much about why schooling was. I also played rugby and I didn't really care because I wanted to play sport. But I came out of school, and in the late 80s in Ireland, the only thing that was hiring was the public sector. So I ended up with a job in the Guards. And I worked in the Guards for years, and it wasn't for me. I never particularly wanted to be in it. Like some people there, it was like a vocation. It wasn't the calling for me at all, but it paid the bills and it was great. And, you could mail it in. And, there's a lot to be said for turning up to work when you pretty much can't be fired unless you do something dramatically illegal. But in fairness to them, I one of my best mates is still in the job, and we've kind of, it's interesting, I followed a path of his career kind of through us going for pints and stuff like that. But I discovered very quickly that I was frustrated, and I always felt like I was smart, but I had no evidence to back it up because I didn't do well in exams. And the weird thing was, I could go into a classroom, I could hear information, and it would never leave me. I'd walk out and I'd have all that information. I'd go into an exam and I would tank.
Blank.
I was terrible at exams. And I kind of felt, I don't know, a little part of me always felt like there's more going on in here. And I always felt like I kind of, people would talk about things going on in the world, and I'd look at it and I'd always see a slightly different angle to everyone else, and I just assumed there was something wrong with me. But then, and in fairness to the Guards, they paid for me to do a degree. And I did a degree. I was fascinated by psychology, fascinated by how the mind works. One of the reasons I was a really crap guard was when you'd arrest someone, I'd always be thinking about, well, why did they commit the crime, and what's going on in their lives and what's going on in society that led them to do that.
You were a great guard.
Not on paper. I was more inclined to let them go, but anyway. But
I'm sure I met you before.
But I did. But I did my degree, and then while I was doing my degree, I read a book by a professor in Canada called Terry Orlick, who was changing the game in psychology and sport. Fascinating character, incredibly smart man. And I took a chance and I sent him an email. And basically what it was I was interested in athlete transition and why athletes were so bad at retirement. So I mapped out kind of my ideas, which at the time, nobody was really talking about transition. It's a common enough thing now. And amazingly, Terry answered my email. And we ended up having a few conversations, and then he invited me over to Canada. And next thing I know, like Terry was working with all the Olympians and all the professional athletes, and all of a sudden the whole world opened up to work with people that I didn't expect. And that led me to 3 continents working in sport. I worked with Isa Nasewa setting up a mental skills program down at the Auckland Blues. I worked with British Gymnastics up to the Rio Olympics. I worked in the Canadian Olympic system where they had their 2 most successful Olympics. It was an amazing experience. I've worked with Super Bowl winners and all sorts of things. Currently working with, it's amazing to me, sport in Ireland, because we love building up our athletes and then we love knocking them down. But there's an Irish coach, a sprint coach working in America. His name is John Coughlin, and John's a very good friend of mine. But John and I work very closely together, and John's coaching a woman called Jasmine Camacho Quinn, who's a 100-meter hurdler. And Jasmine, in the Rio Olympics as a 19-year-old, hit a hurdle, fell on her face, missed out on the final, in the semi-final, missed out on the final. So she was going into Tokyo she's extraordinarily talented, but mentally really struggling. And John rang me and said, can you help? So the two of us used to have these conversations where John he's not a soft coach. He's kind of a drive them to perform. So I was trying to soften his message a little bit so she could get something to help her not panic. And we ended up kind of breaking her whole program down into one hurdle at a time. Like it sounds like a ridiculous cliche, but it was. She was so concerned about what the others were doing, what time she was running, where she was finishing the race, the crowd, all these things. And what she was saying is the only thing you have control over is clearing the hurdle. And once you clear that hurdle, then it's 3 strides, and she's incredibly fast between the hurdles. And she was amazing when she set an Olympic record in the semi-final, won the gold medal in the final. And now she's preparing for Paris. She's trying to be the first woman to defend her title. And I do a lot of work with John on that. And yet nobody ever speaks to John because he's working abroad. And that's kind of how I felt when I've come home. So I've come home from this career in sport, where in North America I'm very well known and I could walk into any job. And then you walk back into Ireland and it's kind of like, well, have you worked in the GA? And it's been a challenge, And what happened, I got very lucky because I came home, my dad was very ill, and I ended up spending about a year with my dad as he was at the end of his life. And I happened to get very lucky that a founder of a company called Pep Talk, a woman called Michelle Fogarty, met me at an event and invited me to meet Bernard Brogan, who was one of the founding members, the scourge of Kerry football. And I ended up working with those lads, and I kind of changed direction. I got into the whole corporate thing and I started to look at kind of leadership in the corporate world. And Pep Talk do a lot of work in the construction world. And then it just got me really looking at leadership and mental health and neurodiversity. And obviously my own diagnosis kind of triggered something in my head. And I'm really fascinated now by kind of leadership in the future world of work and applying the mental skills of sport into the corporate and, the world that pays more money, I suppose. So that's it. And I lecture in the Smurfit Business School in UCD in leadership. And
Let's just bring it back to what you just spoke about around the construction industry, and we can move on then to what Donald's itching there to talk about something else. But it's something that really popped out to me when we mentioned it beforehand, was the condition of the construction industry. It's probably one of our biggest industries in this country, really, but it's also one of the less looked after workforce, if that makes sense. Our workforce in the industry is completely stressed out of its mind. And when people are stressed, a lot of people, and you spoke about neurodiversity as well, a lot of them in the construction industry would be neurodiverse and with no diagnosis as well. And that alone can cause addiction in its own way.
It does, yeah.
But the industry at the moment is under massive amount of pressure. In comparison to some of the research that was done years and years ago, which we still have. Like, can you tell us what's going on at the moment, like in relation to the stats around suicide and or anything that's relatable to mental health?
I think I'm particularly fascinated by construction. I see a lot of correlation between sport and construction, because an awful lot of kids who reach the top in sport do so because at a young age they realize if they don't do it in sport, there's nothing else open to them. Because you're given this message in school that if you don't do the straight A's and you don't get, even if you ever watch a movie, it's always about the guy who's top of his class in Harvard, and it's always like being the number one grade getter automatically means you're the best person for the role.
Success for life.
Yeah.
That's what that's the story that's being told around.
And it's constantly being peddled. And the message in school, and I see it, my own young lad is doing his leaving at the moment, and he's had all sorts of struggles with dyslexia and dyspraxia and a few other things. And the whole message that he's got, and it's not the teacher's fault because they're not trained that way, but the whole message he's got throughout his career, throughout his education, is that you're not as clever as the others because you're getting lower grades.
Yeah,
when actually,
that's a good way to put it.
He's survived the education thing. And I was saying to him, he did maths paper 2 on Monday. And maths is definitely not his thing. But he turned up and he did the exam. And I said to me, you're winning. Like this is about resilience. And this is when we go into further conversation about understanding. Resilience is a word that's trotted around all the time. And actually,
do we actually fully understand that word, to be honest?
Well,
because it means so much to different people.
I think we have a very narrow definition of it. And we think kind of like, you're resilient if you just get over it and get on
with it. But that's not resilience.
But I would argue that neurodiverse kids are probably more resilient than anyone because you've had constant negative messaging all your life.
Yeah.
And if you're still getting up in the morning, putting your trousers on and going out,
finding a way through it,
you're resilient. You're automatically resilient. Right? I mean, we live in a world where there's wars going on all around us. There was a 3-year pandemic, and particularly for kids, they couldn't socialize, which is hugely important to kids, particularly teenage kids. They lost a whole chunk of their education, which I would argue wasn't necessarily a bad thing because I'm not a big fan of the education system. But it's all about their kids. Like we're all surviving shit every day. Whether it's, whether you have a struggle with addiction or whether you have a struggle with mental health or you have a struggle with finances or you have a struggle with a dickhead for a boss or whatever it is.
Or coach.
We all survive every day. But the question for me is, once you survive that day, what is it that we can do to help you thrive? Like, how do we get from survive to thrive, I suppose, is the thing. And I feel like you were talking about stats in the construction industry, and it's actually kind of terrifying. Like, I mean, the rates of suicide are 4 times higher in construction than any other industry. They're talking about various studies have suggested that up to 80% of people have in construction on building sites have had experience of depression. The latest study I've seen suggests that 40% of the construction industry is neurodiverse. Now, I would argue
I'd say it's more.
I would argue it's a lot higher.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, you're not going to declare it because you won't get hired.
But the other side of it is as well is a lot of the construction industry lads are visual learners.
Yeah.
I'm a visual learner. I'm a carpenter by trade. I know a lot of fellas who are plasterers, blocklayers, who they weren't able to do exams, so they didn't even go through.
Or couldn't sit in a classroom.
Yeah, and then at the higher scale, let's look at the engineers. Oh, you're looking at engineers, then it gets even quirkier. Some of the engineers are on spectrums and they probably don't even know it. Super, super intelligent, great at working out problems. But it's across the board. I look at it and you have carpenters and we're problem solvers. Most of the carpenters on sites are foremen and they're running jobs. It's one of these industries. But then what happens is there's a fucking meltdown when time and pressure comes onto us. Mm-hmm. When jobs are running fine, it's grand. But what happens when in that industry, is a muscular industry as well, you have a lot of big men, strong men coming from antisocial backgrounds where like a lot of working class backgrounds, like I'm from a working class background. And when you drive around my estate or any of the estates, you see a van in nearly every second house or every house, a van, a workman's van. You go to a different side of the city, you do not see vans outside of anybody's house. It's the difference. Do you understand me?
Yeah.
So like we're brought up in tough areas and you go into a site and you have a fella fucking putting you down or doesn't understand in the culture that you were brought up in, whereas you keep your mouth closed and you just get on with it, and he's fucking saying something else. He's going behind your back and it causes a lot of conflict then as well, especially when you have a fella that's struggling with his well-being, trying to get work done, has to pay wages. It's a really, really difficult environment to be in, especially at the moment, because there's so much pressure on people.
Mm-hmm. And can I maybe add in a small bit that ties into a lot of the podcasts we do, is like you mentioned maybe 40% die by suicide. Is that the number? Like in the prison system, I'd say the vast majority of people will have some learning differences or learning difficulties or neurodiverse in some way. So if it almost isn't suicide, because I know a lot of the lads who actually end up in prison will also have worked in the construction industry, but as not even as skilled labourers, or as maybe skilled labourers, but without any kind of qualifications and anything. So there's a huge crossover there.
And there's a huge crossover between, I open the correction, but I think the stats around addiction was like 31% of construction workers have some experience of addiction. And if you look at addiction in relation to prison, It's like it's off the charts.
About
And actually-
90% in prison.
I'd say
yeah,
it is.
but then you start to look at neurodiversity in prison,
Mm-hmm.
and you start to realize that as a society, and I guess for me, what I tried to get away from is this idea that, you know, this person's got ADHD, that person's autistic, this person's got dyslexia. They're all labels and they're all accurate. Like somebody has a challenge, right? But the idea that 20% of the world's population are neurodiverse and 80% are typical is laughable, because how many people have you worked with that you would say are normal? Do you know what I mean? Like my idea,
I attract the non-normal.
I use an analogy all the time when I talk about The Office, right? And I talk, like, it's not that long ago that we were talking about making allowances for people in wheelchairs. You know, we had to put a ramp in to allow wheelchair access into an office. And there was all this kind of conversation about disability and allowances. And, you know, it's all about, this is a problem we have to solve. The reality being that once that person who's in a wheelchair has access to a building and can come to work, then they're just a worker coming to work. Mm-hmm. So they shouldn't even be considered disabled anymore. Mm-hmm. They're just a person going to work. You've made the arrangements to allow them access to the building, or, you know, with remote working now, theoretically it should be that a vast higher number of people with disabilities are in the workforce. It hasn't necessarily come out that way off the back of the pandemic, but it should, because this allowances kind of conversation. But you get this conversation with neurodiversity all the time, and and my whole thing is that if we were to acknowledge that we're all different, mm-hmm. that we all function in different ways, where some of us are visual learners, some of us love books, some of us will sit in a classroom all day and gather information. You know, people channel information in different ways. People communicate with each other in different ways. Some people love email, some people hate email. You know, like it's, if we start to kind of think about the recruitment of people, and we start to think about, I hate the word onboarding, but onboarding people into a new job. If you were to actually spend more time sitting down with people, understanding how they work at their best and what they need to be good at their job. And what you'll find in the construction industry is that an awful lot of people are walking onto sites and they're being told, this is how we've always done it, so this is how it's done.
Yeah.
And if you question it as the new guy, you'll be absolutely hammered by everyone else on the team, right? But and it's something that I outlawed in every office I worked with. Anytime I've ever been in charge of a bunch of people, the one thing I've always said is, don't ever tell me we do something because it's the way it's always been done. That's not a reason to do something. Challenge it. Think about, well, why are we doing it?
Exactly.
How do we do it differently? Yeah. So to your point about, like, if we were to start to actually understand addiction, neurodiversity, depression, they're all interlinked. There's a huge correlation between the way your brain works under what we understand as neurodiverse mm-hmm. traits right now, and depression and addiction. But then you understand that if all of that leads, most likely, I mean, it's the common thing. I mean, Roy Keane famously said it in an interview many years ago when they said, if you weren't a footballer, what would you be? And he'd say, I'd be a prisoner. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the option.
I could see that. Yeah. I could see it. I could see it, you know.
In Roy?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
He's one of these guys that would, if he went down to the site, he'd probably say what he had to say. He'd probably get into trouble for saying it. Yeah. But he can say whatever he wants to say as a pundit on TV and get away with it. And people like him for his honesty.
Yeah.
You know, but if you do that in the normal world, when you're not somebody, mm-hmm. when you're not looked up, when you're not put on a pedestal, they'll put you down. Yeah. You know, because they don't like it. You know, and some, it's just the way the world is, isn't it?
It is.
It's when you have that sense of power mm-hmm. and what's the right word? Being famous like Roy, but he was loved. He was my idol growing up.
Still is.
Still, I love that man. I love the way he is in relation to his attitude about life and how he treats people. He's so fucking straight like that.
But he's respectful.
Yes.
And he gets to the point while being respectful. I find him respectful.
There's a huge connection. Like the best leaders I worked with, and I'll go back to sport for a minute, but there's one particular coach I worked with who was not a warm man, not a particularly, they talk about there's someone need a hand around, arm around the shoulder, someone need to kick up the arse. Well, he was never the arm around the shoulder lad. But not 1 minute that I spent in his company or anyone in his team, not 1 minute did anyone ever doubt that what he said he meant. And it meant that everybody knew exactly what was expected of them and everybody pulled in the same direction. And it wasn't, sometimes it was tough because he took me, I remember giving a talk one day and he took me aside afterwards and basically explained to me why it was shit. He tore it apart, right? Yeah. But I had two choices in that conversation. I could let my ego kick in, get wounded, decide, I don't need this and I'm out the door. Or I could stop and think about the fact that this guy had been around the block. He knew what he was talking about and tried to learn from it. And he actually taught me a really valuable lesson. And it was something I was only talking about to Lisa earlier on. The idea that I'm probably better than a lot of people at receiving feedback about my work. I'm comfortable with somebody telling me it wasn't good because you have to be, there's a line in sport about be comfortable or get comfortable being uncomfortable. You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable in order to do something new and to change something. And, like everybody who's ever changed the world has had some level of discomfort while people completely doubted them.
Or criticism or judgment.
And that's the thing. But there's a difference between feedback and criticism.
Yeah.
And one of the things that people and leaders, and I do an awful lot of work in leadership, but one of the things that leaders often miss is that you can't deliver feedback if you don't have trust. And this is where an awful lot of leaders in organizations really mess it up, is if you do what you say and you turn up and you are authentic and people can believe what you're saying, people will listen to what you have to say. But if you flip-flop and change your mind every day and you kind of present an image to one person and a different image to somebody else, people will see through that. And as soon as you try to give feedback, they're going to go,
I don't know. Yeah.
I don't even know what face you're wearing,
Yeah. And what I think as well, and it's just a thought I have kind of, and observing people is, have you got a relationship with, say, your team or with your team of coaches? Because for me, that's key. And even in my own work, it's key in the relationship. And if I have a good relationship with Niall, I can be far more authentic with Niall and say, it's like almost like Roy Keane. If he has a good relationship, you'll hear him speaking freely with people. There isn't a facade being put on, or he's not kind of mincing his words. He just says what he has to say because we have a good relationship. And it's like you and me would have a good relationship when we...
And if you need to fuck me out of it, you will.
And vice versa.
Do you know, I think that's very important.
Need to regularly.
Of course. But I think that's very important in relationships as well.
Yeah.
Especially in all relationships, in couples, in friendships, in work. I think a person being able to express how they're feeling and what they believe in may be different to what is actually happening is important. Even working here with Tony, I value his input and what he has to say about whatever it is, and we'll always look at it. And if I don't like it, I'll say I don't like it. And if he doesn't like it, he'll say he doesn't like it. And that's important because he's not going home in his head thinking about something fucking that we didn't work out through. And it's the same way, and that kind of works everywhere. Like it works for me at home with Nicole, my wife. If there's something I have to fucking say to her, I'll say it to her. Sometimes she doesn't like it because I told her she put on a bit of weight the other day. She didn't like that.
You're on your own on that one.
So I nearly got kicked out of the house over that. So, but you has to that's just my straightness then to her.
Filter.
Later on I felt, but you know what? She appreciated it. If I put on weight, I'd say I'd love to be told straight up. Because I'm comfortable, comfortable, and I might feel that I'm put on weight. But
it's the motivation behind the statement.
Yeah,
that's the important thing.
Yes,
and quite often, and you see, like social media is proving itself to be the worst thing that's ever happened in society. I think anyway, because it's creating division, and all you have two sides to every argument. There's no nuance. There's no. Let's have a conversation where I can believe in your story and believe in yours. You're either Trump or you're not. That kind of thing.
On.
It's and then social media gives you this echo chamber to follow whatever it is I'm saying this, so I'm going to find this tribe who all agree with what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So there's no one actually having a conversation. No. But what happens there is that all of those conversations are about winning. Mm-hmm. They're whose argument is going to win.
Yeah.
I see it there with United the last few weeks and Ten Hag, and is he going to be sacked or is he getting into contract renewal? And there's all sorts of nonsense going on in social media about whether he should be sacked or whether he should get a contract renewal. And you had two sides where people were going to celebrate the result, the outcome. And none of the outcomes that I could see had anything to do with whether Man United were going to be a better team next season or not. It had to do with, I was proven right. Yeah. I won. And if you're going into, especially in relationships, and Jesus, I'm not going to advise anyone on solid relationships, but if you're going into relationships where you have disagreements, if the only thing you're interested in is winning, you're never going to have a healthy relationship.
Wouldn't that be very difficult for a manager then, knowing that he could get the sack like that, and then all of a sudden they don't, his vibe then towards the management of Manchester United, like, it wouldn't be great looking at like how he was treated in the lineup to this. Whereas if maybe management, the chairman came down and said, listen, Ten Hag's not working out, I think we're best off parting ways. But what they're probably doing is waiting for somebody else to come in and say, a manager that's respected, possibly better, to come in. They're waiting for someone to come in and knock at their door.
That's definitely the perception they give it.
That's bad.
Which undermines it.
Is that,
I suppose the question, the thing is, see, the one thing that's always missed is the, you don't know what's going on in the dressing room. Mm-hmm. And it could be a thing. And I would suspect with Ten Hag, because he had so much success with the younger players last season, that the players they want to build the future United around are all very much in his camp. And the guys that are thinking about moving on are the ones who are probably mouthing about getting rid of him. Now, they created...
That's a good point.
They created potentially a situation where it could undermine him completely. But I have a feeling, I don't know, and I'm just going on my own experience and what I'm seeing in the media. I know nothing but my sense of it is that what it looked like at the end of the season, that almost everyone in that squad is up for sale, except for 3 or 4 young fellas. And if those young fellas at their core were with Ten Hag, then is it easier to continue building something with him when he's won a couple of trophies in 2 seasons, I suppose, in fairness to him, and he had a horrendous injury set up last season. So, maybe he's not the worst guy, but he's 2 years into a program where he's bringing these kids through, and maybe it makes sense to build something with him rather than bring in another new manager, and then you're going to have the same thing for the next 2 years.
Starting over again, basically.
And the thing is, like, what you always get in a club, I kind of, from the outside looking in anyway, is that a new manager comes in and he always gives players another chance. Mm-hmm. And most of the players at United, and I'm not a United fan by the way, but most of the players at United, most of those players, the senior players, have seen 4 managers sacked in their time. Mm-hmm. Now, if the common denominator is the players are getting them sacked, then surely get the players out and see if... And I think it'd be really interesting summer if they actually support him and buy the players he wants. And then see if he's any good or not.
Do you know, coming from this now, from a sports psychologist angle, what does it actually take to build a team to be successful? What would your input have to be walking into a team?
It's very hard to quantify, but the one simple thing you need is everybody pulling in the same direction, everybody on the same message. It's one thing you see with obviously I'm a proud Limerick man, and you look at the Limerick hurlers at the moment, and the one thing you see with them, like they were 1 point away in a semi-final 4 years ago from an All-Ireland final. Kilkenny beat them by 1 point, and if they won that game, they could be going for 7 in a row this year. An incredible group of players, incredible unity. But every one of them is bought into the message. Now, how John Kiley has done that, especially in Limerick, where traditionally the county board would interfere and mess it up, or you'd have, certain clubs would have influence in it, other clubs wouldn't like those clubs. And there was massive division in Limerick hurling for years. I remember in the 90s, we had an under 21 team that won 3 All-Irelands in a row, and we couldn't win a senior game because the division and the fighting, and there was a drinking culture and all that kind of stuff. And by and large, Kiley has stamped all of that out. with isolated incidents. But even with the isolated incidents, like there was that whole thing with Kyle Hayes there in the few months and unsavory kind of situation. But the way Kylie has kept them together. And I was listening to, I don't know if you saw after the game at the weekend, local lad, he actually plays in my football club, Hegarty, Garrod Hegarty. He was interviewed afterwards and he spoke so well. And it wasn't arrogance. You need confidence. And this is something that people miss too, is you need a certain level of self-belief to be a high performer.
He's very young. He was interviewed on the pitch after the match.
Yeah.
Isn't that him? Yeah. I watched
But he spoke about, he was basically kind of saying that winning 6 months titles in a row is something when he retires, he'll probably look back on and think this is brilliant. But as far as he's concerned, they're in another All-Ireland semi-final and he's delighted with himself, And then he started talking, like instead of talking about what him and the senior guys have done to win the last 4 All-Irelands in a row, he spoke about a 19-year-old who started at full forward in his first Munster Championship game. He spoke of the 4 or 5 young lads who came off the bench, all 18, 19, 20, who are the guys who have revitalised the group and have driven them on. And he's taking the attention off the old lads and bringing it on. And that kind of sense of collectiveness. And you see it in football a lot. It's very much about me. And it's something I suppose Guardiola has done incredibly well at Man City, is they have an identity.
A collective.
And a collective.
Yeah,
and it helps too to have a bit of a persecution complex. Like if you think everyone's against you, it's a useful thing. Like.
Do you know local lads, and this is probably something that you wanted to talk about as well. Do you know local lads growing up, that are getting caught up, talented young people that are getting caught up in alcohol and drugs?
Yeah.
Is there any way around that, Niall? Or is it just inevitable or what?
Well, it's a certain amount of it is probably inevitable, but I hate to think that anything's inevitable. I'd like to think there's always a means. I think, like when I was at British Gymnastics, we did a bit of research into why, like the women's, and I use the word women very loosely, the women's gymnastics team were all 15, 16, 17-year-olds, children. But in gymnastics, there was an enormous fall off in girls between 12 and 15. There was a huge fall off in participation numbers. And we started looking at the research, and I did a bit of research. I was looking at some research in Australia. Australia has kind of always been a little bit ahead of or traditionally was a bit ahead of the game, especially in the early 2000s in sports science and research and understanding humans and why they function. But one of the things they identified with girls was that where boys had sport, you were either a competitive player or you could go and play recreationally. Like you think of most lads in their 20s that play Sunday league football and all that. That avenue wasn't open to girls. And there was also the fact that, 10, 15 years ago, you never saw women's sport on TV really. And you didn't have heroes who were female. They were always male. And even like in the Millennium, the ESPN did a Millennium edition. And they had the 100 top athletes of all time. And 99 of them were men.
Yeah.
One woman made 100, and which, that's perspective and that's people voting and whatever, right? But it's to your point about kids who end up drifting away into other things. There's probably, there needs to be sport for kids just to go and enjoy it. Not every kid can be an elite athlete. So there needs to be an avenue, like, there's nothing wrong with a club having an A team and a B team and a C team and a D team. And I always loved I was down in Brazil years ago doing a bit of work with their, I was actually doing some psychology training with their football association. But they have a thing, they don't have a reserve team. They're the Brazilian national team, who are gods in Brazil, right? And they've, but their reserve team are called something completely different in Brazil. They're called the Aspirantes. They're the ones with aspiration. So when you play in the reserve team, it's because you want to make the senior team. Yeah. It's not that because their attitude is, what are they in reserve for? What are you holding them back for? What use are they if they're reserve? But it's
great sense.
Changing the language around things makes a difference. Yeah. But it's also kind of like, I'm one one of the things I do at the moment is I'm chairman of the Irish Boxing Association. And, we had a phenomenal weekend last weekend where we qualified our largest team for an Olympics ever with 10 boxers. We're one of only 2 teams who qualified all weight classes in the women's section. America qualified 4 boxers in men and 4 in women, 8 boxers in total. We qualified 10. Jeez. Germany qualified 2. Like, for a size of country, what we're achieving. But then we have that issue where we've got a European championships coming up for the younger kids, the kind of the 13, 14-year-olds. And there's a whole chunk of them that by the time they're 15 or 16 are gone. And, I suppose it's natural for 15 or 16-year-olds to discover, relationships and
drink,
but
drugs.
Drink is, and the culture in Ireland, everything's around drink. You can't have a christening without there being, a feed of pints. So the culture is all around drink. You're kind of almost being told as a kid growing up, and I don't know if it's the same now, but I know, like, for our generation growing up, it was almost like you weren't a man if you didn't have a pint of Guinness in your hand.
I think it might have changed a small bit, the drugs, the drink, from drink to drugs.
Yeah.
Especially where I come from, there wouldn't be as much drinking than there is use of drugs these days. Smoking weed, a few lines of coke, tablets.
I was shocked, actually. I was at I was working at the Electric Picnic last summer. I was hosting a podcast show down there for Shine, the mental health charity. And I was standing at the side of the stage watching, I can't remember who. And I was standing against this kind of advertising horn and relaxing. And this woman in her 30s was standing beside me. And the husband had gone to the loo, And I was chatting to her for a couple of minutes and I was laughing. I was kind of saying, "Jeez, he's a brave man now, leaving on your own in the middle." And all these lads, there was all these lads running out their shirts off, all these jumpers, And
that was me 20 years ago.
But she said, but this is a woman out mid to late 30s, right? And she told me that they left their 3 kids at home. They're having the weekend away, just the 2 of them, romantic break kind of thing. And then she said to me, and it was dead straight. She goes, "Sure, he's gone nowhere. I've got the coke."
Oh, for fuck's sake.
And I was like, huh? Like, really? And he came out and they were like telling me, they bought a bag and they said, "Look, if you'd be queuing all night for a pint and it costs a fortune." And a while later I went into the loo and the way there's the cubicles and then there's the trough, like a horse or a cow feeding you. And we're all standing around this trough. And your man pulls out a coin and he taps a bit of powder onto the coin. He's going to show the pump. And I'm like, "No, you're okay," because like we were recording the podcast right beside where the guards had an undercover thing and there was like a stream of lads getting brought in for drug searches. And all I could think of was, I have to go back to this podcast thing, I got arrested. Like,
but that's very normal.
That's normal.
But what frightened me was that it was so normal. It used to be a thing that you sneak in and lock the door in the loo and tell no one. But I about 18 months ago, I was doing a thing for Sport in Limerick, and Kieran Carey, the former Limerick hurler.
Yeah.
Kieran does a lot of work in addiction, and he also coaches the Patrick Swell senior hurler team. And he said to me in a conversation we were having, he said, "The biggest threat to rural Ireland right now is cocaine." And I was like, I thought he was exaggerating. And he said, "Niall," he said, "every GA club around the country," he said, "all of these kids are taking their training so seriously. They're all lean, they're all fit and strong." And he said, like, the level of fitness in youngsters in rural Ireland now is incredible. But he said, if they go drinking a feed of pints, they're going to fail when they get a fat test or whatever it is the next day or whatever, or the fitness test and all that, they're going to be suffering for it.
And they'll be suffering for 3 or 4 days after.
You take coke, you're not suffering.
No.
And it was... I was.
You're fresh on Monday.
That's the short-term effect.
Yeah.
The long term,
because of their age, they're only seeing a short-term.
Yeah.
Like that's
they don't care about the long term. You think you're bulletproof at that age.
So that kind of leads me into what we were talking before we started, where I was really looking forward to meeting you. Okay, so I'm very much about, like, if we can cut it off before it gets to become a problem for people.
Yeah.
So I was saying to you, kind of, I have a couple of, I'm going to call them elite athletes. They're elite athletes to me, and they're coming to me, and they're sports people, and they found that maybe moving away, can we call it retiring, from their sport, or kind of moving away from kind of maybe being more competitive in the sport, that they found themselves drifting into, I'm going to say, problematic behaviors, not just cocaine. In fact, cocaine isn't for a lot of people, more kind of processed behaviors where it's more along the lines of sexting or compulsive sexual behaviors or gambling for a lot of them.
Yeah.
And they find themselves kind of, and what I'm noticing is, like, obviously I'm a psychotherapist, so everything will come back to when you were in your earliest days in life. But there was something early on, and that would have led, maybe sport might have taken them out of that, but sport can't be there all the time. Some people get injured and life goes on and there's these issues come in. And then at the end of it, they're retiring, can we say that? And all of a sudden they're in serious trouble. And can you talk to us a bit about that and maybe how we can even prevent it earlier on?
I think,
what are your thoughts?
I think one of the key things that I've seen in the work I've done, the research I've done into, we used to call it transition, but that word's been taken over by something different now. But the identity is a huge part of it. Mm-hmm. And if you think about it, even just for somebody retiring at the age of 65 or whatever it is, right? If your whole career, you've been identified as what you do, mm-hmm. once you stop doing it,
what's left?
Who are you?
Yeah.
And one question every athlete I worked with, I always asked them, the first question I asked them, deliberately just to kind of throw them a little bit off thing, was who are you? Mm-hmm. And every retired athlete, their answer to that question, every single one of them was, I used to be a sprinter, a rugby player, a skier, a swimmer, whatever. Mm-hmm. And that's what you used to do. Mm-hmm. But their identity is so tied up in that, and their ego, because they were getting a hell of a lot of praise. Mm-hmm. And I remember a few years ago, I sat down with Anthony Foley, do you remember the Munster rugby player?
Of course.
And it was actually the year before he died. He was coaching Munster at the time. And we had a fascinating conversation about his experience of retiring. Now, he got very lucky in that he drifted into coaching very quickly. But one of the things he was talking about was that he realized as soon as he finished that all his friends were in rugby. Everyone that he identified with.
His whole life.
All his school friends he'd lost touch with.
Yeah.
He said he'd see people in a pub and he'd say hello and he'd chat with them, whatever, but he didn't know them. Mm-hmm. All of his buddies were still in the system. And what happens then is that they're in this bubble. And the way he described it was, he said that when you're a professional rugby player, mm-hmm. you've got 40 weeks of the year mapped out. You know exactly where you're going to be. Mm-hmm. You know what days you're off. You know what you're eating every day. Mm-hmm. Like everything is mapped out for you. I discovered this with every athlete I worked with. I mean, there was one particular British rower that I worked with who won 3 Olympic gold medals. And at the age of 30 had never booked a flight or checked into a hotel himself. Everything was done for him. And they didn't have a social life. Like everything was revolved around the Olympics. So for 4 years of their lives, their whole focus was making the team first and then winning the gold medal. And that's the routine. But when he spoke about that, and he's a guy who I would have always seen as being like diehard Munster and all that. Mm-hmm. And he said his biggest regret was he never went to play in France. And I was kind of going like, you strike me as being a real Limerick man. Like I could never see you being outside Limerick. But he said, no, he said, I'd love to have gone and learned another culture for coaching. And he said, it probably would have protected me a little bit more from that. Now, he kind of said he got lucky because he got back into the coaching very quickly. Yeah. But then he looked at some of the lads that he played with who weren't so lucky. And I remember I did a thing with the former captain of the All Blacks, Kieran Reid. And he told me a story about a prop who had retired, an All Black prop who had retired, and he'd fallen on tough times. And they have a network, an ex-players network in New Zealand, and they have these get-togethers, and they get together for a few drinks, and they kind of look out for each other. And this lad had no work; he was kind of struggling mental health-wise and all that. And they kind of gathered around him, and in I think it was in Auckland, it could have been Canterbury, but I think it was Auckland. They have this thing where they have milk rounds, and you buy a license for a district. And then basically all the houses in that district are your milk round. So it's up to you then to go and see if people want to buy their milk off you. And you go around in a cart and you deliver milk to the houses, right? Mm. The question is, as a former All Black, are you too proud to go and do that? And he's like, no, sod that. It's a chance to make some money. I'll take the license. So he took the license anyway. He had his little vest on and he's driving his cart and he's delivering his milk.
Lovely job.
But you know what? Kieran was telling me that he met him about 5 years later in a coffee shop. And your man rocked in and he looking great. He said, how are you getting on? He said, I'm doing great. He says, I own five districts now. And he basically owned half the city now. But he was making more money than he ever made as a player.
Yeah.
But that kind of thing, like there's an element of...
You found purpose.
Purpose, exactly right. And it's also if you see, because you've been famous as an athlete, do you see yourself as being too good to do something else? Yeah. And sometimes we need to strip it all back to, you know, if you need to pack bags at the supermarket to keep food on the table, then pack bags at the supermarket.
Do what you have to do. I've put my hands in fucking 4-inch pipes full of shit, you know, because I had to provide for my family, and I still do it.
But the thing is, like, the thing that holds people back in that is the fear of what other people are going to say. And the thing we don't realize is that people don't really think about it as much as we think they do. And if they do, fuck them. You know?
That's it.
You've got to live your life.
That's it. But that takes time to be able to be in that position as well.
Yeah.
I would have been one of those people that gave a fuck before, who cared about what people thought of me. And I would have been super sensitive, you know, the ADHD stuff. I didn't realize that a lot of people with ADHD are really, really sensitive. And I didn't realize that. And there was times where, because of my background, I would have got shit over it. And do you know what? I fucking dealt with it. And my skin got harder. It got thicker. You know, and no, I just get on with it.
Yeah.
I don't look, I don't have that mind that wants to go looking for the shit about me anymore either.
Yeah.
You know, because there's an addiction to that too.
And to your point, when you're working with somebody who's kind of starting that road, it's trying to get them to it's getting back to that question about who are you?
Yeah.
Because who you are has nothing to do with what you do. That's just how you earn your money. But like getting them to think about, you know, how do you turn up in the day? How do you turn up in your relationships? You know, what kind of person are you? What are people going to say about you after you're gone? Kind of thing. That's far more important than this idea that, you know, I used to be this and now I'm lost. Because it's actually, I believe it's a misconception that people suffer because they don't have the, you know, playing in front of 70,000 people or whatever. There's no doubt that's, you know, every player who sits in the stand, every ex-player who sits in the stand and watches the game and says, geez, I'd love to be out there.
Yeah. Do you know, getting the applause.
But the dopamine thing, when you talk about ADHD, I mean, ADHD is all about dopamine and understanding where you get your release from. And, you know, you can get a release of dopamine from going for a walk, or you get a release of dopamine from going to the gym, or you know, like doing something that makes you happy.
Eating chocolate.
Eating chocolate,
more for the chocolate.
I try to avoid that particular one at the moment.
But you know, I was thinking of when you were speaking about successful athletes, I brought my mind back to the likes of your Ronaldos and your Messis. Like, Ronaldo's nearly 40 years of age and he's still playing.
Scored 2 goals against Ireland on Tuesday night.
It's going to be tough for him stepping back down, because Ronaldo has been the number one on the planet. Well, number 1 or 2 consistently with Messi for the last 10 to 15 years.
See, my thoughts on that is he's big and famous that he's going to pick up stuff.
But he'll still have to work with somebody.
I find that interesting, because I look at him and I'd be concerned about him.
That would be
I mean, not financially.
Yeah.
He's sorted down Saudi, but even Messi. I read this morning, I think it was, maybe it was last night, I read an interview with Messi where he said, I'm going to finish my career at Inter Miami, but I'm not ready to stop yet. He said, I love football. I don't want to, and then, nor should he stop. You know, you stop when your body tells you to stop. Yeah. And playing in America, or Ronaldo playing in Saudi. I mean, Ronaldo could well have a brilliant Euros because he's played in low intensity, no stress football down in Saudi. And he's been protecting us. I mean, I don't know if you saw the Irish game on Tuesday night, but he scored an absolute wonder goal. And you're going, he scored 2 goals against Ireland. The first one was an absolute cracker. Yeah. This is a guy who's nearly 40 years of age. and the body on him, you know. But
it's ridiculous, isn't it?
But I always feel like Messi kind of talked about the fact that he'd won the World Cup, made it easier for him to move to America, because kind of it was like mission accomplished. I feel like with Ronaldo, he kind of, it's an ego thing that he now has to win the Euros to kind of because him and Messi pushed each other along, and their goal scoring when the two of them were playing in Spain, when he was at Madrid and Messi was at Barcelona, and they were scoring 50 odd goals a season, and one scored 50, the other scored 51. Like, they were amazing, the two of them.
But you know the difference between the two of them. When you look at the Argentinian team that won the World Cup, right, and the Portuguese team that were there as well, and Ronaldo spent most of the time fighting with his own fucking players.
Yeah.
And Messi was looked up upon as the leader, and maybe Ronaldo does want to win the Euros this time around, but maybe it's more of a team. He needs to play more of a team effort than an individual.
Well, there's definitely a perception that Ronaldo is more ego-driven. The reason I said I'd be concerned about him is obviously not financially. And I'm sure he'll do loads of media work and all that kind of stuff. But you just get the sense of that he needs to be loved, and he needs to be number one. And if Portugal win the Euros and Ronaldo ends up like, I mean, realistically, you wouldn't expect a 40-year-old man to go out and play and have a big impact on the Euros, but he could do. I mean, the guy's a freak. He's a phenomenon. Right? But if he leads Portugal to the Euro, to win the Euros, it'll probably be because he scores a lot of goals. But it won't necessarily be because he did an awful lot for the team or he led the team, to your point. Whereas I thought the Argentinian team were incredibly smart, and the manager was incredibly smart, and that he completely changed Messi's role in the team to allow Messi to protect his legs, because he couldn't run like he used to.
Yeah.
So basically Messi kind of performed in like a 10-meter spot in the middle of the field, get the ball and then, lay it off and score a goal. And it works. And in the final, he was phenomenal. But the team was built, and everything was built to go through Messi, and then Messi brought everyone else in. Whereas Ronaldo, it's very much, put the ball in the box and I'll score it. Now, if it works, I mean, Portugal have a phenomenally talented squad, and I actually think they're potentially one of the favourites. Some people in the room might think England are, but I think Portugal are a team to beat in this thing. I thought they were very impressive against Ireland the other night, albeit that Ireland were piss poor. But I do think that there's a difference in leadership and what you're depending. I feel like with Portugal, you're depending on there being a leader in the team to hold the team together and then present the ball to Ronaldo. And then if they do, like they did on Tuesday night, he scored 2 brilliant goals. And like the guy he's a freak, and he's one of the best players we've ever seen. And
that was a powerful statement you made there, and I think you're absolutely right. If they leave him do his thing and they bring in a real leader that can bring the team around Ronaldo, not because he's special or anything, but he's a goal scorer and he will get you goals. Yeah. But leave this one person be the leader. But
and actually that comes back to what we were talking about with neurodiversity and if you're talking about construction or whatever, or any industry. The key thing that I'm always going on about is, why would you hire somebody who's incredibly talented in a certain area and then try to pigeonhole them into doing something completely different? Like, if you've got somebody who's creative, why are you so strict on, well, they're missing deadlines, or they're late to meetings, or okay, but what's their role? Like, you wouldn't ask Messi to defend in that Argentinian team because the team is weaker if he's defending. But what you do is you identify the fact he's going to win us the World Cup. So he can stand up there all bloody day if he wants, as long as when we give him the ball, he does something. And the same with Ronaldo. Yeah. If you've got talent in your organization, it's the ultimate stupidity to pigeonhole it or restrict it from doing what it's good at. And I think that's where an awful lot of organizations fail. And it's why we've seen, the history of, say, the C-suite, from all the C-level jobs in the corporate world. It's only in the last couple of years that there's an actual chief innovation officer. There's an actual room for a creative on a board of an organization. And part of the reason for that, and actually the ironic thing is that it's probably neurodiversity that's held that back. Yeah. Because the typical person on a C-suite, at C-suite level, at CEO, at CFO, at whatever, are generally coming from legal background, accounting background, very spreadsheet driven, very data driven, very kind of bottom line driven. And we know from the research that the legal industry, the accounting industry, the medical industry is massively neurodiverse from an autistic point of view for people who are incredibly good at focusing on one thing and numbers being the key thing. Yeah. So we talk about neurodiversity like it's this problem of people who are really bad at school and who aren't that bright and who hold us back. And we never think about the fact that people who are extraordinarily good at school are equally diverse, just different.
Different, yeah.
And if we actually stop thinking about the label and start thinking about how we're all different, and then if you think about how we're all different, there's room for the spreadsheet people and the numbers people and the people who, in fact, they're essential. Because if you had a whole room of creatives, nothing would ever get done.
Do you know what's
so it's finding that balance.
Yeah. Do you know, and it just popped into my head, and I know you're writing a book as well around neurodiversity as well at the moment. How far into that are you?
I have a publisher who would love me to say it's done. Yeah. And I have a manager in the room who's kind of like beat me with a stick about just letting it go. My own neurodiversity gets in the way that I can't. It's pretty much done, but I find that I keep going back. It's not good enough. I'll change it.
But you know what was sticking out to me around the neurodiverse stuff for you, because you've understood so much about it, and which you being a sports psychologist as well, is maybe a coach in finding out someone's strengths and probably working with them. And because a lot of people who are neurodiverse, they can't really stick at one thing. Like, I fucking touch off everything, and it's like, whoa, if I just stay at this, I'll be really good at it and I'll be really secure financially. But it's like, yeah, I'll touch off this for a while, move into the next thing. And what I really need is somebody to say, right, Timmy, sit down with me for an hour, 2 hours, and talk to me. Let's talk about your strengths. Let's talk about your weakness, what you like, what you don't like, and start pinpointing, you know, and pinpointing and just getting them into a bit of routine and creating a bit of structure, a bit of balance around calendars and stuff, because I'd be all over the shop. Like, I double book a lot, you know, I do a lot of different fucking things. I forget things. I have to keep my phone in my hand when I'm making an appointment to book a calendar, because if I don't, I'll forget. And that's a big issue for me. Have you ever thought about it?
Do you know, I haven't, and now I am.
Because it really stands out to me as in somebody who has a really, really strong kind of understanding where people's strengths are and their weaknesses are, and your own understanding of people in general and how we work. I think a lot of people could really benefit from sitting down with someone like you for an hour or two, or maybe 6 or 7 sessions, and getting their life really in track. You know,
I'll be launching a new website next week, so you can keep an eye out. It'll be Neuro-coach, it'll be the top line.
The last time I gave someone an idea like that, right, that fucker went away and started his own online fucking ADHD.
What a fucker.
Yeah. ADHD assessment. They started getting people, psychiatrists from online, abroad, doing assessments, which I recommend by any means. But yeah, I think that would be a great idea, Niall. I think it would.
10%?
I'll promote it,
I'll be back.
I'd say we're nearly out of time, are we?
Yeah.
I'd say, quick question for you. Your podcast, would you say a small bit about it?
So it'll be going through a rebrand. We just finished season 1, and I called it Inertia Creeps, which is a song by Massive Attack that I love. And the message of it being that inertia is doing nothing, and creeping mean that we're increasingly doing nothing. And what I talk about in the podcast is really about leadership, but it's very much about understanding difference. And I have guests, like I've got one of the top neuroscientists, Paul Zak, came on, and he talks about the measurement of trust. Fascinating conversation, great guy. I had a guy last week, Steve Kerslake, who has a company in England called Construction Sport, which is all about raising awareness of suicide in the construction industry. And he spoke, it was a great chat, but it was a really tough one at times, because he spoke about friends who've taken their own life, and how the construction industry lends itself to that, and the way back. And actually what he does is a really lovely thing, actually, is he organizes between construction companies, he organizes this football kind of competition, like an inter-firm kind of thing.
Yeah.
And but it's all construction, and it travels around the UK, and they play, and there's a league, and there's competition and whatever. I was saying that we'll have a European Championships, so we'll get all the Irish guys involved.
Yeah.
You know? But and that's something to think about, actually. Another business. But yeah, I've been criticized by my branding manager that it's too negative a name, so I need to come up with something a bit more positive. So I'm going to be talking about something. Well,
I just see if somebody asked me, I'd probably struggle to say it.
Yeah.
So I'd probably say, look up.
I've been wanting to do it. It's a song that the names resonated with me for years, and I've always wanted to do it. And then as soon as I did it, I went, actually, it is a bit difficult to say.
It is. Maybe it could be a subheading. Especially for people like me with dyslexia. It's just challenging
people to think about leadership and thinking about our brains and how they function differently. I kind of talk about neuro-inclusion and the psychology of success, I suppose. And one of the things I think is really interesting, and it's something that's been the core of my book, is I speak to a lot of people who've achieved remarkable success in their careers, but all of that success has been off the back of some failure or some tragedy or some dramatic event. Mm-hmm. And it's really fascinating to me that it's not just the resilience piece of how you got around that, mm-hmm. how you pivoted and moved on, but also what does success mean to you afterwards? Mm-hmm. Because rarely our idea of success when we start out is the same idea we have at the end. And I always think of it, just to finish with my dad, and not long before he died, I got to spend a week with him in the clinic in Galway, and I stayed in Galway for the week, so I got to spend loads of time with him, and I'm so grateful for the time. But at one stage I was lying on the bed with him when we were chatting, and he was talking about his life, and he was basically talking about his successes and the things that made him happy. My dad was, as far as I'm concerned, the smartest man I ever met. He didn't know it, which probably made me kind of admire him even more. He had no ego at all. Like, he was the most...
That's powerful, though.
Yeah, and he saw the good in everyone. But the one thing he said to me in the bed was that success to him was his 3 sons were close. You know, that the kids he raised are all healthy and they're close to each other. His grandkids are all healthy. And he talked about, I brought him to Spain, myself and my eldest brother brought him to Spain for a weekend, and he'd never been abroad before. I had a house in Spain at the time. We went and we spent a few days there, and Jesus, it blew his mind. Like, we were picking lemons off the tree and making gin and tonic, and it was amazing. Yeah. But he spoke about experiences, and it made me realize that life is about experiences. It's not about stuff.
Spot on.
And when we actually try to reframe our ideas around success, to think about, well, you know, if you're lucky enough to have that end of days lying in bed moment, the last, you know, like your last words kind of thing, to look back in your life and say, well, what mattered? And it wasn't the car or the house you bought or the holiday you went on. It was the people you spent it with and the things you did.
And believe it or not, that's actually how I live my life today. But I live it in, it's the experiences, because what I've learned is, and just I think it's probably the work I do in primarily around the addiction stuff where people are just gone. Yeah. Is that you do have to keep it in a day and think of as many experiences as I can have, not as much as I can gather in terms of money and prestige. And it's kind of looking back and having all the, and people, I think people are a very, very important part of it. That's my own experience.
Can I ask you one question actually before we go? When you're dealing with addiction and you're counseling and you're listening to people who have really difficult situations, and some of them aren't going to have good endings from it. And I struggle with the idea that, you know, we had this war on drugs, which is basically about punishing addicts. We have gambling addiction in sport now, and what do? We ban the player who's got the gambling addiction for punishment. 10 months or a year or whatever it is, instead of dealing with the problem. Like, half the teams in the Premiership are wearing betting companies sponsorship on their shirts, and we're punishing the guy who's got the addiction.
That's ridiculous.
You know, like, we do this all the time. We punish the person instead of looking at the problem. But for your perspective, when you're dealing with that, and that's very difficult stuff, how do you look after yourself?
look after myself. I have the likes of Tim. I have great friends. I'm very lucky to have the friends I have. My family, huge part of it. Fishing is a big part of it. Mindfulness is a huge part of it.
Fishing and mindfulness go hand in hand.
They do really. I think balance is what I figured out, but it took me a long, long time to get balance. And I think a big part of it as well, and what I'd be recommending, is understanding of it. Try to understand it. It doesn't get you as overwhelmed, or doesn't get you as run down, because you kind of see, you see the humanity in people as opposed to the suffering in people.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like I find it much easier to sit with people when I can see, like when you actually see a person. Like I had a great day today. It's not that it was like, it's going to sound awful, but I really got to sit with people. I think I had 6 clients today, and I think 3 of those sessions were really good sessions where we kind of came out with something positive out of it that we took away, that kind of, and I think that's, if you take away 3 out of 6 and they're really good, that's kind of a way of managing it. I think that you're saying I'm having some impact on people's lives in a positive way, and that's
100%.
You know, and going away fishing over the next couple of days, like that's just time away from all that kind of stuff. I coach kids as well, so it's a question I wanted to ask, if you don't mind, with the last one. Any advice you'd give me? I'm not a good coach.
You're a good person,
but I love spending time with the kids. Genuinely. Now I do a bit of shouting and all that, like, and I'd be calling you melt.
I don't think it's about the coach, though, is it? What do you think, Niall? Like, you can be a good coach, but I think if you're just a good person, it actually, we were talking about earlier on, making sport enjoyable and fun for some of the kids, because not everybody's going to be brilliant at it.
Exactly. Yeah.
But if you're a good person, not even a great coach, you will really make sport enjoyable for kids.
I'm with a group of men at the moment, and women. There's 2 women there, and there's 4 or 5 men, and they're absolutely they're great. But we're competitive. The kids are competitive. But how do we kind of encourage them to meet their own potential? That's kind of where we're struggling at the moment. Because you don't want to be shouting at them and making it's all competitive.
In gymnastics, I saw both sides of it. And one of the biggest challenges that I had was dealing with parents, to be honest with you. But parents and coaches, when the ambition of the parents and the coaches didn't match the ambition of the kid. And there was one particular girl who was self-harming and missed out on Olympics because of all sorts of really awful stuff that was going on. But while she was being treated, and while she taken this is kind of in the lead up to Olympic selection, like, and while she was being treated for her issues, her mother was negotiating leotard deals for the Olympics, like completely kind of ignoring the fact that the kid was. And
this kind of came public, did it? Is this recent enough?
Well, yeah. I won't say too much specifics because I don't want to get dragged into a legal case. But it's hard to blame the parents because you get so caught up in it.
Yep.
And you want the best for your kids. And when you're watching a game and your kid is playing, you're going to see your kid.
Yeah.
So you're automatically going to think your kid is better than everyone else anyway. You know, like, because you're watching your kid all the time. You see everything they do. Yeah. And you're not seeing anything what other kids are doing. Anyway, I think from a coach perspective, the most important thing to be is consistent. That they know exactly what they expect from you.
Yeah.
And then it's, when you're talking about reaching potential, it's the best environments I worked in were environments where the athlete had a say in what the outcome they were planning for was.
Good man.
And that's the thing. Let them dictate what success is.
Yeah.
Because if they don't want, like, they might not care about winning the championship.
Yeah.
They might be thrilled to win one game.
Yeah.
And then when you're getting frustrated about not winning other games, it's you're getting frustrated for yourself. They don't care. Yeah. They're happy. Yeah. You know, and it's kind of like, and you get to a point then where you start to feel it out and you kind of go, well, if you have a team that's capable of going and winning a league, well then, you know, it's very hard because then you have 1 or 2 kids who aren't up to that standard and they continuously then start to get sidelined because winning the league's all important. Yeah. And it's kind of, and I've always kind of believed that in New Zealand, they pick underage teams according to weight rather than age.
Oh, really?
And the idea is that if you're a really big 10-year-old, you run through all the other 10-year-olds on the field. So you're not learning any skills. So if you're a really big 10-year-old, you play with the 12-year-olds. And then you get landed on your arse every time you run with the ball, and then you learn you got to offload and you're going to do something different. And but it's also that it's not about competition until later. And I've seen that in various sports in different countries that they
don't make it competitive. I know rugby did take us.
And I don't want to get down the road of being there are no winners and losers.
Yeah.
I mean, my young fellow was in school. I remember in primary school, and they wanted to get rid of the school sports day because it wasn't fair to kids who didn't win anything. And my young lad was about half the height of everyone else, and he was never going to win a race. But my kind of feeling was, and he desperately wanted to win something because I was working in sport, and he wanted to be proud and all that kind of stuff. And I was kind of like, I just want you to be happy.
That's all.
And he had one other kid in his class, and his ambition every race was to beat that kid, and all the rest of them were off racing up there. But my kind of feeling with it was, how do you, and this is where we fail in school, because we start telling them that life is fair and that if you work hard enough, you'll be successful. And, there's a huge slice of luck in being successful. And there's a huge slice of timing, and, everything has to fall into place at the right time. But instead of telling everyone that life is fair, if we actually kind of let them figure out that you can't be good at everything.
All the time. Or even all the time.
Or all the time, or sometimes ever.
Yeah.
For my young lad, it was very clear from an early age that he wasn't going to be an Olympic athlete. But that just meant that he then kind of started to channel his interests in other areas. And he discovered he loved being on stage singing, or he loved, doing something.
Or he might just love the sport.
Or he loves, and he's now a complete football nut.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't destroyed by failure in sport as a kid.
See, I love fishing. I could spend a week fishing and do nothing else. But it's not competitive. Yeah. But a friend of mine asked me, will I join a club and into competition? I said, then it's gone for me. Because by nature, I'm extremely competitive. And I try to dampen that because I lose my shit. Do you know what I mean? So even coaching kids, I'm like, try and manage yourself and reduce it, and it just comes out all wrong. But I think if they can just kind of enjoy the sport and enjoy the process of it, that's what my hope for kids is, that they'll keep playing and just enjoying it. And it doesn't always have to be competitive. But you'll have the ones then who will come out and they're by nature, they're very competitive, So,
but the thing is, it's an environment then where everyone has a right. So if a kid wants to be competitive, you try and create a team that they can be competitive in. And if a kid doesn't want to be competitive, they get a team where they feel equally valued, but they just go out and have fun.
Exactly. Yeah. So get the kids together and say, what is it you actually want? Do you want to be more competitive? Do you just want to have fun? That's the advice.
Every organization I've worked with, it's I would always say that I never really worked on psychology. I worked on distraction control. So when you get a team that are good, you get them to sit down and think about, what are our distractions and how do we get rid of them? And that's kind of the next step. But I think to begin with, the best, I'll give you the example very, very quickly, because I know we're going way over time. The best athlete and coach that I've seen working together was a British gymnast called Max Whitlock. And his coach is a guy called Scott Hahn. And Max and Scott, incredibly close relationship. But Max is probably the greatest pommel horse gymnast of all time. He's gone through 3 Olympics. He's won 3 gold medals, a couple of silver, a couple of bronze. He's by far Britain's greatest gymnast that's ever lived, right? And Scott is a brilliant coach. But what they did together from day one was they sat down, and at the start of each Olympic cycle, they'd say, where do we want to go? And at the time, Max, as a 19-year-old, won a bronze medal in London. And obviously the British invested hugely in the London Olympics. They identified soft medals like all home nations do. And pommel horse was one where, in a lot of the things in gymnastics, a certain country would dominate, but pommel horse was kind of wide open. So they said, right, we're going to invest in pommel horse. That's going to be our thing in gymnastics, and we'll invest in rowing, and we'll invest in cycling, and we're going to pick up soft medals in all these, because it's really important for a host nation to be top of the medal table. So Max got his bronze medal at a 19-year-old in London. But then after London, Max and Scott sat down, and the overall gymnastics champion was a Japanese guy, a guy called Kohei Uchimura, probably the greatest male gymnast that's ever lived. In fact, no probably about it. Absolutely is the greatest male. Incredible guy, won 6 world titles, 3 Olympic titles, and frustratingly an incredibly nice guy. Brilliant.
Don't you hate
one of the greatest athletes I've ever seen, right? So you're planning for the next Olympics where this guy is the best athlete that's ever lived. What's your ambition? And Max and Scott basically sat down and said, I want to get closer to him on every apparatus. I might not beat him in all of them, but I want to get closer to him. So they put a load of work into an all-rounder, not just pommel horse. He went to Rio, and then he surprised everyone. He won a gold medal on the floor, and then he won a gold medal on the pommel, and he won a bronze medal in the all-round. So suddenly, he's not quite at Kohei Uchimura's level, but he's the second best male gymnast in the world. Yeah. And then he goes on, and then injuries and stuff, and he's getting older, going into Tokyo, and he went and he retained his title on the pommel. And now he's actually going into Paris to try again. But every step of the way, Max sat down with Scott, and Scott, instead of Scott having the ego as the coach of going, I know what's best, you'll do what I tell you, it's, what do you want to do? Where do you want to go with this? And Max would say, I want to do this, I want to do this, I want to do this. And then Scott says, okay, well then, if that's what you want, we're going to have to do it. It's going to be tough, but we're going to do it, and we'll do it this way. And then Max would buy into that, and they'd work together. So that Scott is still the boss, but the athlete has dictated what he wants. And I think if we go back just to tie up, go back to the construction world, or not even the corporate world even, we spend so much time as leaders feeling like we have to tell everyone what to do, that we have all the answers. And the best leaders I've ever seen are the ones who ask the questions. You hire great people, let them answer the questions. Yeah. If they're good, if you've hired them for a reason, then let them tell you where you're going. And it's amazing what you can achieve when you actually stop thinking you have all the answers and you actually start to listen. Because nothing's surer than the kids coming out of school right now and the kids coming out of college right now have a completely different view of the world than we had. And if we try to insist on our way on them, we're going to fail.
Yeah. 100%.
And you're going to end up with this constant churning of talent. They're going to stay for a year and then bugger off somewhere else.
And very angry people.
Exactly. And disgruntled and whatever. But if you actually sit down and instead of calling them snowflakes, you engage with them and say, all right, well, what do you need? If you're going to revolutionize my business, what do you need to do it?
Spot on.
And who knows what it'll take you.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
That snowflake comment as well can be a bit of a dig towards the newer generation. Because it's classified, the snowflake generation they're a bit soft.
Yeah.
And they don't like that either.
No, and it's unfair on them.
Yeah.
I mean, there is all that stuff about being woke and all these kind of like conversations that are hard, particularly for our generation to get our head around. And there's certain things where you can be a little bit too sensitive. But the reality is that these kids are walking into interviews and they're interviewing the company.
Yeah.
And whether you like it or not, that's the way it is. So now what are you going to do about it? And the thing is, it doesn't mean that you have to cede all the power to them, but you just include them in the conversation.
Exactly.
And you get an awful lot more out of them, in my view. Yeah.
Niall, thank you so much for joining us.
That was excellent.
Enjoyed it, lads. Thanks for the invite.
I felt like we could spend probably the next 2 or 3 hours going through so much different stuff, but hope when your book is coming out again, it'd be great to have you back on. So listen, thank you again. Donald, thanks a million. Thanks. And Lisa, thanks for the introduction. Thanks. Really appreciate it. And as always, Tony, listen, thank you so much for everybody listening at home. I'm Timmy from Long Way Back podcast. And from the lads, thank you. God bless.